Welcome to Chapter 3, Why Everybody Trades. Comparative Advantage. Adam Smith, who was a Scottish philosopher, as back in his day they didn't have economists, he called himself a philosopher stroke political economist. But back in Adam Smith's day, Adam Smith, the guy who invented the idea of specialization, came up with a theory of absolute advantage. And in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith promoted the idea of free trade by comparing nations to households. And he said basically that if two households were producing some things and they didn't consume all of what they produced, then it would be in their interest to trade some of those things that they produce and basically buy other products using the proceeds from what the household can sell to others. And the same should apply to nations. And if it's the case that you can produce those goods at a lower cost than other people can produce those goods, then it's likely that you're going to be trading those goods for things that you don't have an advantage in producing. And so he coined the idea of absolute cost advantage. So the idea that if you have a lower cost, you have an advantage, and therefore you're going to export the goods where you have an absolute cost advantage and import the goods in which you have an absolute cost disadvantage. So notice that in this case, individuals, if we're looking at households, or countries, if we're looking at countries, would specialize. So it does follow Adam Smith's insight into specialization and basically the division of labor, as he called it. In other words, the idea that labor should do what they're good at, and what they're good at should then lead them to do it at lower cost, and therefore they should be doing that and producing excess of it for what they need for themselves and using it to buy things that they don't have an absolute cost advantage in. David Ricardo came along and said, no, that theory is wrong. Or perhaps put another way, it's only half right. So David Ricardo basically said that the one thing that was missing from Adam Smith's notion of absolute advantage was the idea of scarcity. That is that you might only have a certain amount of resources, and therefore you might not have a cost advantage in doing something, but you still might end up doing it just because of the scarce resources that are available. So for David Ricardo, the key here is relative prices or relative costs, and not absolute prices or absolute costs. So in other words, when we're looking at relative prices or relative costs, it's a question of, do you have relatively lower costs of doing things, in which case you should produce those things which you have that relative lower cost in producing. In other words, and this is the way David Ricardo thought about it, you should look at the opportunity cost. So if you have a lower opportunity cost of producing something compared to someone else, then you should be the person producing that good or service. And that, claimed David Ricardo, was the basis of trade and not absolute advantage. So the idea here is that, the scarcity of goods and services, and therefore, it's a question not of whether you're better at something in terms of cost, it's whether you're relatively better at something. Now, I always use in my undergraduate classes, I use the example of, if you're sharing an apartment with someone and they are way better at cooking than you and a little bit better at cleaning. Does that mean, following Adam Smith, so Adam Smith's theory of absolute advantage, that they should do both the cooking and the cleaning and you should just lie on the sofa watching TV. No, that wouldn't make sense. You would sit down with them and you would say, which are you relatively better at? Oh, it's cooking. Well, I'm still not as good at as you in cleaning, but I'll do the cleaning. So the one thing where I have the least kind of relative disadvantage. So that's how David Ricardo's theory would work. So that's the theory of comparative advantage. So when applied to a country, comparative advantage implies that the country is going to export the products it can produce at a lower opportunity cost. So in terms of the other goods that could be produced within the country compared to the other country. And it's going to import the products where it has a high opportunity cost. Now, in the Ricardian theory, he focused on labor productivity for different products in different countries. So the basis for trade, what underlay, what was traded and how much of it was traded, was the relative differences in labor productivity in the Ricardian model, as we call it. So the US, for instance, has a comparative advantage in production of wheat and a comparative disadvantage in the production of cloth. It may still be cheaper in producing both wheat and cloth, but it has a relative advantage in wheat because it produces wheat for much lower costs than, for instance, it might produce cloth at. Now, if that's the case, then obviously the rest of the world has a comparative advantage in producing cloth and a comparative disadvantage in producing wheat. Once again, it implies specialization. So with free trade, the US will export wheat and it's going to import cloth. How can we show this? Well, we can show it very simply by just looking at a PPC, or a production possibility curve. It shows the combos of amounts of different products that an economy can produce. Now, it assumes that we have full employment of all factors of production, and it means that we're actually using those factors of production in a maximum way. So fully utilizing in an efficient manner all of those resources or factors of production, as we call them in economics. Now, with no trade, each nation's choices for the consumption of wheat and cloth is limited to a point along its own production possibility curve. Production possibility curve shows the combinations of the wheat and cloth that any single individual country can produce. So if we're in autarky, in other words, if we don't have trade, we must be at most on our PPC. What we're going to show is that with free trade, we can actually move beyond the individual PPCs for those countries. And that shows the gains to trade, so the advantages of trading in a different way than we showed in the previous chapter. So let's have a look at where each country specializes. It's point S1. So here on the left-hand side, we have a PPC for the US. In other words, what it says is that the US could produce either 50 billions of units of wheat, or it can produce 25 billion units of cloth, or it can produce some kind of linear combination of the two. And we have it so that in autarky, the preferences of the country, of the consumers in that country, would have it producing 20 billion units of wheat and 15 billion units of cloth. So that's where it would be in autarky. Now we look at the foreign country, and in the foreign country they have a PPC that runs from 67 billions of units of wheat. So the foreign country could either produce 67 billion units of wheat, or looking at the other end of the PPC, it could produce 100 billion units of cloth. Now the opportunity cost of the PPC is basically what is an opportunity cost? If you remember from Foundations of Economics, it's what you give up to get something else. So let's look at the first PPC. If we move down that PPC slope for the US, we give up $50 billion of wheat, billion units of wheat, and we gain 25 billion units of cloth. So the slope of that curve, that PPC, the line that's labeled PPC that goes through S1, S0 and hits the x-axis at 25, is 2 for 1, 50 divided by 25. Now, the slope for the rest of the world is 67 divided by 100. So in the first case, if you remember, the slope is 2. In the second case, the slope is 2/3. So they have different slopes. In other words, they have different opportunity costs. They have different trade-offs, putting it a different way. So let's go back to this slide here. With free trade, what's going to happen is that consumers in each country can consume at any point along a new trade line, for example, point C, and enjoy a higher standard of living. So how do we get to this trade line? Well, what we assume is what Ricardo said would happen. Under trade, we're going to look at we're going to try and produce the good in which we have the lowest opportunity cost. So we give up less of the other good to produce that good. So in the US, the opportunity cost is basically 2 units of wheat for 1 unit of cloth. So it's 2 units of wheat for 1 unit of cloth. In the rest of the world, it's 2/3 unit of wheat for 1 unit of cloth. So who has the lower PPC? Who has the lower opportunity cost? Well, it's clearly the rest of the world. They have a slope of 2/3. But remember, this is wheat per unit of cloth. So the foreign country, the rest of the world, gives up less wheat to produce a unit of cloth. Therefore, it should be producing cloth. Now, obviously, the opposite will apply to the US. The US, it gives up a greater amount of wheat to produce a unit of cloth. Therefore, it will give up less amounts of cloth to produce a unit of wheat. It would only give up half if we turn that the other way around. So instead of a slope of 2, we went 1 over the slope to give us a half, if we're measuring in terms of wheat. And for the foreign country, it would be 100 divided by 67, which is 1.5. So it's half versus 1.5. Well, it'd be lower for the US. So the US will end up producing wheat. Notice that the point that the US ends up at is S1 in the left-hand diagram, and the point that the rest of the world ends up is S1. Then they decide to trade, and they've decided to trade on a 1-for-1 basis. So there's no dollars here, notice. It's a question of barter that we're using here. But they're trading a unit of wheat for a unit of cloth. That's the trade price that they agree. But that means that what the US can do is produce our 50 billion units of wheat, and we can just give up 20 billion units of that 50 to take us to 30. Now, that means we're going to get 20, because we've given up 20 units of wheat, but we're trading those 20 units of wheat for 20 units of cloth. So that means on the x-axis, we're going to end up at 20, not 15, 20. That means that our consumption point, that's why it's labeled C, is at 30 units of wheat and 20 units of cloth. Notice, so it's on that trade line, but also notice, most importantly, that it's outside our PPC. In other words, we couldn't have got to that point by ourselves. We only got to that point by trading with someone else with a different opportunity cost to us. Now, in the rest of the world, they're going to trade their 20 units of cloth for 20 units of wheat. So they're specializing in cloth, though, so that's all they're producing. But they're going to end up at point C. Notice point C, once again, is outside the PPC for the rest of the world. So this is a very, very simple, very, very basic framework. And yet we've shown that if two countries with different PPCs, different slope PPCs, I should say, trade, that they can benefit themselves in the sense of getting to a point that they couldn't get to all by themselves. Those, therefore, are the gains from trade. So on the left-hand diagram, the gains from trade, in this case for the US, would be 10 billion units of wheat and 5 billion units of cloth. For the rest of the world, it's 4 billion units of wheat and 4 billion units of cloth. Nevertheless, notice that both entities are better off. So without trade, each country's consumption is going to be limited by its own ability to produce those goods and services. In this case, goods, so we're looking at wheat and cloth. With trade, though, they're going to specialize and they're going to move outside their own PPC, giving them an ability to to consume more. That's the gains from trade. So here we have a question. Does it make sense for a country to pursue policy of self-sufficiency in, for example, food or energy? Why or why not? The answer to that question is clearly no. It doesn't make sense for a country to pursue a policy of self-sufficiency. And indeed, even when I hear politicians say, oh, America's self-sufficient, what they mean is that we export more than we import. There's still certain types of fuel that we cannot produce in this country. We have to import that type of fuel. I had no idea about this, but jet aircraft fuel, for instance, cannot be produced from the oil that we produce doing fracking. It's just not that type of oil. So it can't be produced, it can't be converted into jet fuel. So we're going to have to import jet fuel, however much oil that we produce for other purposes, and we can export that. So, what this shows is that we should not try and be self-sufficient in everything. If we don't have a comparative advantage in it, then we should not produce it. We should import it from someone else who does have a comparative advantage in it. So what are the implications of the theory of comparative advantage? So, according to the Ricardian model, relative price differences arise from productivity differences. So these are productivity differences that arise from labor. And in the Ricardian model, these then are due to exogenous meaning outside of the system, differences in technology amongst nations. So, although comparative advantage determines the pattern of trade, absolute advantage, of course, how much cheaper you are at doing something than someone else. If you're going to end up doing it from comparative advantage, the absolute advantage does end up being important in determining the income in that country. So the question arises, does absolute advantage matter? So if free trade is so good, why do so many people fear it? Well, as you can see from the Ricardian model, if you were in the US in this simple circumstance and you were a cloth producer, you would really fear free trade. Why? Because it would put you completely out of business. If you were in the rest of the world, and you were a farmer, you would completely fear free trade because, once again, it would put you out of business because you know that the rest of the world would end up importing US wheat. Activists and protesters have recently been complaining loudly that trade has had bad effects on workers in developing countries, workers in the industrialized countries, and the natural environment. Analysis of absolute advantage and comparative advantage focuses on a resource called labor. So let's focus on trade and workers. A big part of the answer to these questions is that absolute advantage does matter, but it matters not for determining the trade pattern, but rather for determining national wage levels. And the reason why is that if you have an absolute advantage in something, usually it's because your workers are more productive. If they're more productive, then their wages are higher. And of course, higher wages leads to higher national living standards. Workers can receive higher wages and enjoy high living standards if they are highly productive. Workers with low productivity are paid low wages. And we can see, this is good evidence for the Ricardian model in a way. So it shows that wages and labor productivity are clearly related. They are correlated from this diagram. Thank you.